Hi, in this session we are going to map components. So what is a component? In most simple words, a component is a part of a whole in such a way that if the whole is destroyed, its parts are also destroyed with it. For example, if a house is destroyed, all its rooms are also destroyed with it. So the house is the whole here and all the rooms in it are its parts. Also, each component, that is, each part, may belong to only one whole. It is not shared, just like the room in your house is part of only your house, not your neighbor's. The term component actually refers to Java composition relationship. It is a contained object that is persisted as a value type. So its existence is dependent only on the entity that contains it, as it doesn't have its own database identity. So when you have components in your object model, like the address here being a component of a person, you'll have more classes than the number of corresponding database tables to store data for them. Just like the example here, where we have two classes, person and address, but only one table to store data for them. So we are mapping two classes to one table. For example, in the diagram here, we could see that the address component is contained by the person entity. So when we persist the person entity to the person table, the address component will be persisted as a value type. Also, a component cannot be referenced by any other entity than the one it is contained within. And now that we've had a good understanding of what a component is, let's go ahead and start mapping it. So here's the person class, and we all know that to make it a persistent entity class, we mark it with the entity annotation. It has an identifier attribute, ID, and a name attribute. And here we have an address class to have only the address specific details in it. And to make it a persistent component class, we mark it with the embeddable annotation. Notice that it doesn't have any identifier attribute because remember, a component has no individual identity. And now that we've made this address class a persistent component class with the embeddable annotation, to make it a component of the person entity here, we mark this address attribute of type address with the embedded annotation. And that's it. All we needed was the two JPA annotations, embeddable and embedded, to map this address class as a component of this person entity. And once the mapping is done, you just have to tell Hibernate about your person entity in the Hibernate configuration file for Hibernate to be able to take care of its persistence. And that's it. Now let's go ahead and do some Java persistence. So here's the client class we're going to use to persist a person object. So you first create an address object, then you create a person object and associate it with the address object, and then simply persist it using the Hibernate session object. And here's the result you're going to get once you persisted the person object. Great, we've just seen component mapping in action. Now, I'm sure you must be asking that where did this person table come from? Who decided the name of the table to be person? Because we did not write any schema for it, then who really created it? And how could Hibernate figure out that it had to map this person entity to this person table? We did not use any table annotation for that mapping. And how could it map this ID attribute to this ID column? We did not specify the name of the column for it to map to using the column annotation. And similarly, how could the rest of the attributes got mapped to other columns? So how did it all happen? And the answer to that question is two-part. The first is that Hibernate uses reasonable default values not only for XML-based mapping metadata, but also for annotation-based mapping metadata. So when it finds a mapping information missing, it uses a sensible default value for that. So by default, if it doesn't find the table annotation on an entity, it's going to use the name of that entity as the name of the table to which that entity will be mapped to. And the name of the entity here is person. So it's going to map this person entity to the person table. Similarly, if it doesn't find the column annotation on an attribute, it's going to use the name of that attribute as the name of the column to which that attribute will be mapped to. So if the name of the attribute is ID, it's going to get mapped to the column with the name ID. So it was as if we had these annotation that I've colored in green here already present in our mapping metadata. Now, the second part of the answer is, in case you noticed, we used this Hibernate property called Hibernate mapping to data definition language .auto and set its value to update. What it does is that it uses the mapping metadata of the person entity to create and execute this schema against the Hello World database, which will have this person table created for you. So it creates tables for you and continuously updates them whenever there is a change in the mapping metadata in your persistent entities. It's a really good tool to use in a development environment. And although it's not really advised to use it in production, some people use it even in production. And yes, this not null came from the nullable attribute being false here. All the columns are nullable by default except the primary key column. So I hope you've got your answer of how we got the person object persisted to the person table. Now, if we wanted to customize the individual attribute mappings in the component class, we could use the column annotation. For example, if we wanted to map this city attribute to the address_city column, we could use the name attribute of the column annotation. But sometimes you will need to override the settings you made in a component class from outside for a particular entity. For example, by default, the attributes of this persistent component class will be mapped to street, city, and zip code columns. But if you wanted them to map to columns with some other name for this particular entity, you could do it using the attribute override annotation. So now for this particular person entity, you will have the street attribute mapped to the address_street column, city attribute mapped to the address_city column, and the zip code attribute mapped to the address_zip code column. And when a person has two addresses, say a home address and a billing address, using the attribute override annotation will actually be a requirement, as the name of the columns for the home address will be different than the ones for the billing address. So you won't be able to achieve that without using the attribute override annotation. And finally, a component is also called an embeddable object, which is embedded inside an entity and persisted as a value type.